comes on. So we're live right now. We'll just wait another minute. Everyone doesn't have to stop talking. I'm just alerting you that we're live. So,
We've all become serious.
yeah, I know. I shouldn't have said that. We're starting.
Sorry, I'm having this ginger tea. My throat is so bad.
Actually, that's a good idea. Let me get some water at least. Yeah, 1 minute.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because I lose my voice somewhere in between.
I have similar problems.
So we'll start in a minute.
Anita's just gone to fetch water.
Yeah. Good evening and welcome everyone. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Zahra Hamdani Mirza and welcome to Multiple Feminisms, the intersection of tradition, history and violence. It's part of a series of curated discussions before the launch of A Beautiful Despair, The Art and Life of Meher Afroz, edited by Niilofur Farrukh. This will be the first comprehensive book on one of Pakistan's most significant artists. I'm joined by a very special panel today, and I'm going to introduce you to them in just a moment. But first, our theme for the day. I thought we'd start by a few quotes from the book itself. And first of all, in 1983, when Meher Afroz signed the Women Artists Manifesto with 15 of her peers, it was more of a pledge to uphold women's rights under threat during Zia's dictatorship and less as a promise to dedicate her art to feminist ideals. According to Niilofur Farrukh, Meher as a strong woman has challenged stereotypes both in life and art. And most of her adult life, she has been a major contributor to the family income, and her art has never shied away from being a fearless female lens on societal ruptures. Savita Apte, a curator and researcher here with us today, says Meher subscribes to a feminism that is far from the strident feminism of the West. Its echoes are located in the works of a sorority of South Asian artists of her generation, whose thoughtful challenges to the status quo explore the themes of gender and gender politics. According to Asim Akhtar, another critic who's contributed to the book, Meher's paintings are confrontational, but in the generally accepted sense of the term. For example, they do not show anything violently horrifying or terrifying. The confrontation happens with the work of art as a catalyst. And now I'd like to introduce our panel. And first up, our moderators, Salman Asif is here with us from Islamabad and Niilofur Farrukh. Salman Asif is a historian, academic, and award-winning documentary filmmaker. He has served as senior international advisor at the United Nations on gender equality, women's empowerment, and culture. Niilofur Farrukh is a critic, curator, and writer. She served on the board of the International Art Critics Association, ICA, as vice president. She's one of the founders of Karachi Biennale Trust. She established Karachi Biennale and currently serves as its managing trustee and CEO. And of course, she's the editor of A Beautiful Despair. Savita Apte, joining us from Singapore, is an independent researcher and curator whose focus is on colonial and early post-colonial South Asian art history. She's the founder director of Art Dubai, and she also oversaw the Abraj Group Art Prize and its publications from 2006 until 2015. So welcome. Ms. Salima Hashmi is here with us from Lahore. She is an artist, curator, and contemporary art historian, the founding dean of the Mariam Dawood School of Visual Art and Design at Beacon House National University, Lahore. She also served as principal of National College of Arts, Lahore. Ms. Hashmi is also a council member of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. Welcome. Anita Dubey, joining us from India, artist and the first female curator of Kochi Museurist Biennale. Dubey is the co-founder and board member of KOJ International Artists Association and has contributed text to many publications on contemporary art. Welcome. And Sangeeta Thapa, who's joining us from Kathmandu. She's the founder of the Kathmandu Triennale. She is an art critic, founder, and director of the Siddhartha Art Gallery in Kathmandu, and has been actively involved in the promotion of contemporary art in Nepal for over 20 years. Welcome, everyone. I'd also just like to tell all of our attendees who joined us that you received a Q&A button on your screen. So we will be taking some questions at the end of the session. So feel free to type in your questions right now. And I'm going to hand the floor over to our moderators. So over to you, Niilofur and Salman.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we're looking forward to the input and insights of all the panelists today to the theme, multiple feminisms. In South Asia, it's not been an easy terrain to work in, but it's been a very urgent and important area of work because of the shifting political, social narratives. In the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen artists have not only kind of found new ground to work on within this thematic, but also they have faced tremendous odds. Especially in the last 30 years in Pakistan, particularly, we have faced extremism. We faced all kind of, mechanisms of control while women are concerned. So I'll kind of briefly give you a kind of overview of things. To begin with, I remember when I was an art student in the 1970s, Lubna Agha put up the show of her white paintings, which was full of this incredible sexual energy. And it took everyone by surprise. And that to me was a feminist movement that was later picked on by people like Nahid Raza, who with her biographical works, painted the first probably and the only pregnant nude to celebrate her own body and maybe kind of de-link it from the voyeuristic connotations already female nudes had in this country and everywhere else. And of course, her narratives as the single mother, which was again bringing into discussion things like the stigma attached to divorced women, in the 70s, Pakistan. And of course, we are all aware, and I think Zara mentioned how Ziaul Haq altered our politics. It altered the way we looked at our rights. And with that came an urgency to begin to say our own story. The women's rights movement was picking up steam. It was founded during the 80s and it began to kind of take root. And we really wanted to be the ones to take control of our narrative. And I think women artists did that. And I remember my first book, in which I documented 3 pioneering women which came out, in the 90s, but was against the backdrop of the 80s, in which I used documentation as a tool to kind of confront erasure and marginalization of women. And these 3 powerful, influential women, I felt needed to tell their story and it to be documented and preserved. So, we faced ups and downs. And then, of course, the 90s brought with it the extremist and the jihadi interpretation of the politics of the body. And here we see, control of a different kind altogether, using tradition, using orthodox interpretations of religion, and interfering within the social fabric of the country. And, one of the works that comes to my mind and has stayed is 72 Virgins for My Suicide Bomber by a young artist, Mariam Agha. Here she brings into discussion how women's sexuality was used to entice young, potential suicide bombers by the recruiters. And this was all recorded within those cassettes that were found by the authorities. So, the whole terrain has been contentious, it's been difficult. And also to take this narrative to the public has had its own challenges. But I think throughout people who have worked in this area, art professionals, educators, art practitioners, the artists themselves, have done so with tremendous passion and commitment. They have been empathetic to each other's stories. They have highlighted certain areas that nobody was ready to talk about. And to us, that is the greatest gift of this multiple feminism and diversity that we see across South Asia. And I'm sure, the other panelists will kind of give us perspectives from their own location. So having said that, I'd like to now invite Salman to, to give his opening remarks. Salman, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here. Could you hear me all? Well, thank you very much indeed. Could my point of departure be my absolute sense of elation and sense that I'm in the presence of my art college teacher, Mrs. Salima Hashmi, not just a teacher, a friend, a mentor, as she has been of countless students and teachers of the National College of Arts, a consistent motivator. And equally, the reference point for today's discussion is Meher Afroz's work. And Meher Afroz was my external juror for my art college thesis. So it brings back a sense of continuity, a sense of lineage, a sense of camaraderie, which is ever expanding and ever deepening, as it were. But let me take you to some of the standing points that I would like to very, very quickly look at internationally, starting from perhaps Yoko Ono's performance, 1964 performance that she repeated later also in 2003, the cut piece, in which the artist sat on the floor in a traditional kneeling down, passive Japanese posture, and she let complete strangers cut out pieces of her clothes, and they were allowed to keep those pieces with them until such time that she was completely unclothed. The performance, as we all know, was an act of unmasking the sheer nature of violence against women, its historical erasure, continued and systemic attempts to silence the discourse, attempts to reduce it to invisibility and be, in fact, normalized in the name of tradition and belief, and more than anything else, public participation in act of violence against women and girls through their omission, through their choosing to look the other way. More recently, we've looked at the Arab Spring. And throughout the Arab Spring, as we all noticed, that it was motivated, enabled, and has been accompanied by a wide range of cultural performances, productions, experience, which for example, to me, seems like a powerhouse theater of immediacy that reflects a context of intense socio-political struggle that destabilizes and even reconfigures the previously dominant, congealed structures and networks of power and identity. In Pakistan, and Madam Salima Hashmi is part of this history, one of the leaders in leading some of the artists in campaign against the dictatorial Hudud Ordinance, right from February 12, 1983's cumulative demonstration on the Mall Road, Lahore, in Pakistan against dictatorial edicts of the then military head of the state, self-assumed, self-styled head of the state, to the recent Aurat marches, the women marches in Pakistan to commemorate International Women's Day on March the 8th, you find that a space of few meters is transformed into a powerful stage where all art forms and more, music, graffiti, theater, posters, humor, song, photography, poetry, they all testify that protest, resistance is inherently a cultural feature, which is a significant part of the multiple feminist movement in art. The significant artistic component where artists themselves played, they outsized their own role in unfolding contemporary uprisings. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is where you find art becoming transformative. This is where you find each crackdown, each attempt to silence creative expression and expression, freedom of expression and expression of freedom both. It kind of bounces back. Each crackdown by repressive regimes and outfits has produced more art, has stimulated more and more powerful voices. While there's a compelling evidence of intergeneration transfer of beacon, for example, in Pakistan, many other countries, but the question that I have in my mind, and I'd like to hear from our very, very capable panelists, is that has that beacon been transferred from one generation to the other generation? And I do take the point that every generation must discover and craft its own voice, its own beacon. But has it happened? And if it has happened, where do you situate it? Where do you view it in terms of the melting pot of creative expression in the larger multiple feminisms discourse? Thank you. So with this, I would like to, first of all, invite Sarita Apte to share her reflections. Sarita Apte, to you.
Thank you. Gosh, I don't know how to address any of these questions. And so in my normal way, I decided to do some research that might help me formulate the questions and look for some of the answers myself. And I was horrified at the most recent statistics show that women of the world perform 2/3 of work hours, are paid less than 1/10 of the world's wages, and own less than 1/100 of the world's wealth. So it's incredibly sad that we seem to be constantly going 2 steps forward and 5 steps behind as women. I went back trying to tease that point in history where this imbalance began. And it seemed from everything that I've read anthropologically that during the hunter-gatherer period, male and females were considered equal. They had equal rights. They had equal importance. No one was considered more important than the other. As man began to settle down and became a settled creature, it became easy to push one person into the forefront and leave everyone else behind. And to a large extent, this was all because of property and landowning. It became the easiest way to hold on to property and land by saying that it could only be passed from male child to male child. While there were parts of South Asia where there was a matrilineal society, this was over time pushed to the fringes of society, and all for this very capitalist notion of owning land and property. So it seemed to me that there must have been a point at which there was a real shift in the thought process. And this was codified uh, through in my research in 200 BC, written down after various Talmudic um, waves of knowledge had spread from their center. And within the Indian text, there is a sentence from Manu that says, woman is a perpetual minor and has to lead her entire life under the guardianship of the father, the husband, and the son. Note, not only is she considered a minor, but there is no personal pronoun. There is no her father, her son, and her husband. It is the. She is objectified right from that 2nd century BC. Nothing improves from that point onwards. In fact, it gets worse and worse and worse. And yet, even within that, during the Vedic period, you see boys and girls being educated equally. Everything remains the same until that point at puberty when there seems to be a very sharp distinction between the way males are going to be treated and the way females are going to be treated. There is, for about 3 or 4 centuries, a certain amount of awe around women. Certainly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the goddesses are more dominant than the gods. The goddesses are whom you worship for good agriculture, to keep you away from snakes, to make sure your king is the right king. So it seems that you always go to a woman to ask for her boon, but you never worship the people, the women around you. This is some kind of spectacular way of separating the woman next to you, the ordinary woman, and the goddess who is benevolent, who puts a child in the woman's belly, who is all protective, and most of all, who is all protective of what is considered the male lineage. I'm truly horrified, and partly because I hadn't quite analyzed this for myself until this came about for this webinar, and partly because even though I knew all of this, I hadn't pulled all the strings together to the enormities. And some of it is the fact that we are having this conversation and this book launch and talking about a woman artist in the backdrop of a hashtag Me Too movement and a general awareness of the parts of society that have been underprivileged. And I need to say right from the very start, I come from a privileged background. I came from educated parents who educated their daughters. But this was a very small and privileged background. In India, or in South Asia, I should say, in undivided India and South Asia, there's been a long tradition of educating women, of having women of letters from privileged families. In very, very rare instances, and not really till about the 17th century, do we see levels of education seeping into the non-Brahminical families or the non-higher caste families. And so it was with enormous joy that I kind of found Rekhti, which was a 17th century construct from Awadh, from Lucknow, where Meher comes from. And Rekhti was the feminine version of Rekhta. Rekhta was a hugely Persianized ghazal form. And in it, it was very clear that the addresser was male. The addressee, or the object of the infatuation or love, could be female, could be male. But in general, it was couched in wonderful terms so that people could even say it was actually a longing for the divine. Rekhti had no such pretensions. Rekhti, even though it was partially originated by a man, Rangin, at least that's what we think, used the language of women. It was an everyday language. It didn't pretend to use Persian. It did use the ghazal form, for which it was denounced hugely because they didn't want it to be used. but it spoke to women about the most ordinary things. It elevated everyday items into something that was worth noting. It elevated the fact that she wore her ghungat in a particular way, that she had a malmal cloth that one could see through and see the beauty of her, the shadow of her nose. It was about everyday things. It also harped on the sexuality of women and women's desire. And for that reason, it was battered down by the Victorian British. But before I talk about the kind of Victorian import, I should also point out that several of the wives of the Nawabs of Awadh wrote Rekhti themselves. They often penned it under pseudonyms, and sadly, a lot of them have been lost because the British had a rather strict Victorian way of thinking about this hypersexuality, as they called it, of these obscene poems, and therefore forced the destruction of a lot of Rekhti poems. But enough fragments have survived that we know that it was a beautiful contemporary form of expression. When it was read, when some of the Rekhti was read in a feminist forum in the United States by the writer Ruth Vanita, the American Feminist Society couldn't believe it had been penned by a man. And they said, it's not possible that a man has written with such a sympathetic voice about how women feel. And so obviously in the 17th century, there was again some notion of a recognition that men and women needed each other, that desires were mirrored both in men and women, that feelings were the same whether you were a man or a woman. Where and how that began to change really comes down to colonialism. And once again, as in so many ways, colonialism has a lot to answer for in eroding a lot of giant strides that were being made at this time. On the other hand, it is also due to some of the colonial practices that we see the first Indian or South Asian feminists come to the forefront. And this really happens in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, mainly heralded in the state of Maharashtra, mainly by non-Brahmin women who are educated by their husbands. And the first feminist text is written. And the literal translation is comparison between man and woman. And it is a terrific text, still stands today. And the author, Tarabai Shinde, says, why is it that women are forbidden to do certain things? And why is it that men are forced into doing certain things? Surely society should be far more equitable. And she begins in her own way to say, well, maybe one of the ways to claw back some forms of dignity for women is to make education compulsory for young girls, is to ban child marriage, is to ban dowries, and to ban sati. And that begins a vast movement all across South Asia as well as Southeast Asia, in an acknowledgement that there are societal changes and cultural changes that can and should be made. All the while, these aren't feminists that are, they question the status quo, but they don't put themselves in opposition to men. They don't kind of go, oh, it's men and women and not, it's two opposite sides of a coin and we won't find a happy medium. These are women who, in very, very, I find typically Asian and maybe even Arab ways, gently cajole equality from the everyday. There isn't a militancy, and because there isn't a militancy, there isn't a pushback from society until a lot has been gained by the women of the time. And you would think that this is a great start and we would make enormous strides, but sadly, no. Various things happen, and this feminist dream, this feminist fight, this urgency about for feminism trickles into nothingness. However, at the same time, there are changes. There is education for women, and in the 1850s, when art schools are set up, it's only 20 years before the first women students go into art schools. In Chennai first, and then in Calcutta, Bombay, and Lahore very, very quickly afterwards, one after the other. It is, of course, only privileged girls of privileged backgrounds, and this normally has to do with wealth. But there is another change that is also helping feminism, and that is greater urbanization. And with urbanization come nuclear families. And with nuclear families come break away from old rigid patterns and feudal systems. And therefore, young men encourage their wives, who are often very young, to educate themselves and to move ahead of even the husbands. Once again, in the 1920s and 1930s, it seems that there's a huge efflorescence and great strides are being made. This is somehow, though, incorporated and co-opted into the struggle for freedom against Britain. And women's rights are sort of, I would say, take a secondary stance at this point, and everyone is fighting towards a common goal, which is freedom. And there's a wonderful sentence that one of the authors of the time writes, and she says, in doing so, they founded an agnostic liberal universalism of early Indian feminism, the discourse of individual rights that arose not so much from women's relation to men, but from women's relation to the collective identities of communities. And this is where we have been for a long time. We don't fight about our life, about ourselves as individuals, but about ourselves as part of communities. And this is what distinguishes South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Arab feminism from the very militant feminism that you see in the West. This is the feminism that we feel part of is not about negating the male and not about confronting the male, but it is simply about saying if the male is considered human, why not the female? What is it about us that you are denying us our humanity? At Niilofur's request, I was looking at Southeast Asia as well, and I was reading a lot, and then I decided to actually talk to two young artists. And what I heard from a young Malaysian artist and a young Indonesian artist, both of whom asked to be kept unnamed in fear. They said it's very difficult to think about and talk about feminism in either Malaysia or in Indonesia, because the systemic rule has been, if you're talking about feminism, you are being brainwashed by the West. And the West wants to destroy our religion, our way of life, and our culture. And at every point, these young women are finding that they are denied certain very basic rights. From the right to exhibit their artworks if they are considered too flamboyant or too controversial. And everything, by the way, is considered controversial, from political controversy to religious to sexual controversy.
Savita, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but agree. Thank you.
And so I find that there's a common thread that runs through South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Arab lands, which is that in spite of all the major differences, there is a constant, persistent rivulet, drop, drop, drip, drip, drip of a fight for feminism. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Savita ji, for this truly vast overview, and you've trajected a vast terrain of historical journey. But without further ado, I shall invite now Mrs. Salima Hashmi to share her reflections for us for this evening.
Well, if we'd been talking 6 or 7 months ago, I probably would have approached this very differently. I think the last 6 or 7 months have demonstrated very clearly the rise in violence towards women across the world. And it doesn't matter whether it's the West or the East, it doesn't matter whether it's India or whether it's Pakistan or it's Bangladesh. We have seen the most horrific of crimes, whether it's a Dalit girl, raped and killed across the border, whether it is a young little child's body defiled and found floating in a pond in Pakistan. It has demonstrated the crisis which has to do with the world's approach to women. Yes, this pandemic has made us rethink a lot of things. We have rethought what we're doing to the planet, the eco-collapse. We're looking at the scarcity of resources. We're looking at the food insecurity. We're looking at the rise in population. Can we sustain it? We're looking at climate change. Have we really looked at the way that half the world's population is treated? Have we looked at what it means not to celebrate, not even to make them secure? How can you talk about mass weapons of mass destruction, and in fact what you're out to destroy is the sense of life itself, the essence of life itself. And therefore, the frame that I would have had, 6 months from now, with reference to this talk, I think that frame has kind of altered. And what I'm looking at now is, with greater urgency, is when we talk about feminism, it does not matter whether it comes from the West or whether it's homegrown. What we are talking about is really a whole half of your world's population at risk. And yes, some of us are very privileged. We have evaded what has been the lot of most women of this world. So and I'd like to talk a little bit about Meher Afroz's work now, kind of in the context of this view in which there is something that we can only call an unspoken alliance of the powers, vested powers, which will not allow women to come to a point when they have a sense of fruition of their own talent. When I first came across Meher Afroz's work, it was during the Zia years. Niilofur Farrukh has talked about her signature on the Women's Manifesto that Lara Roch and myself drafted, and we surreptitiously invited these 15 women to my house to sign, and it was a secret document. It was a secret document because we knew that we could not make it public. But it kind of, it was our resolve by putting our names to that we had a sense that perhaps the direction of our work would change. Meher Afroz's work, when I first saw it, was as a printmaker. It was a national exhibition. She was one of the winners, and she was an unknown quantity entirely. It was probably her first her first appearance on the national scene, and she was known as a printmaker. And I was terribly intrigued by her work because it was very subtle, and it seemed to speak at a subliminal level about certain realities which had to do with, I think, her great uprooting from India to Pakistan as an adult, as a young adult who had already studied art and coming and trying to find her feet in a very barren space, I would say, in Karachi, and how she worked her way into making opportunities for her art form, which was printmaking. I think the fact that her work at that time has that element of almost of subterfuge in the way that it appears, and her mark making. It's very quiet, but it's assertive. And that, I think, has been her hallmark. The act of actually, when you lift the paper from the plate, there is that moment of suspense when you don't know how the work is going to turn out. And it is there that you have invested all your hopes and your dreams and your desires, and then the paper is lifted and you're confronted with what you have done. In many ways, that has been a sort of way that Meher Afroz has worked for most of her life. I have watched as the sense she moved away from being a printmaker and sort of was duplicating, or I would say was translating that mark making into directly onto the surface. And then experimenting with those surfaces. So they became denser and denser. And I would say they very often took you on several journeys in which you were not sure that you were going to arrive at, where you thought you would arrive. So that element of surprise stayed within her work. It was a kind of the kernel of her work. I think something that Niilofur mentioned in introduction about the women who signed that manifesto, so many of them becoming interested in the body. And the fact that the body was supposed to be clothed and you're supposed to have a chadar and you're supposed to be behind four walls, that was a sort of diktat of the time. But the fact that in their work, the women were free and they made sure that the body appeared. Not so with Meher Afroz. The body was kind of camouflaged, but there were symbolic sort of appearances. The garment is something that comes into her work over and over again and becomes a cipher. And because it's a cipher, she leaves her audience to kind of decode what she's saying. And to me, and much later, that garment actually became textile. So it just sort of moved yet again from the surface into something that had a more tangible presence. But in all of these years, I think what has been hinted at and what has been demonstrated is a very steely resolve. A steely resolve which is there with constant dedication, very careful, I would say very careful designing of her surfaces in such a way that you can't fault them in any way. And even when the body remains elusive, something that is within the body, the essence, is speaking and I would say singing out loud. And to me, that is really Meher Afroz's beauty. To me, I don't find there is despair. I find that there is a recluse there who is keeping her own counsel. And because she's keeping her own counsel, you have to be in dialogue with her. You have to work as hard as her. The artist makes you work hard if you want to enter into her reality, if you like. For me, knowing of her circumstances, knowing of the fact that she has been the pivot for a home, for her own little community, and has been, I would think, absolutely unmindful of so many external things while filtering them into her work also. So you will find her antenna out there, but will she let you know, what she is thinking? No, she won't. And to me, then in that sense, she's kind of, she is really the essence of the wisdom that is really the woman's role in ensuring that she is a survivor. To me, the 21st century is the century for women. And I think that because it's the century for women, I think that we need to brush aside all these ideas that feminism comes from elsewhere. No, Feminism comes right from here. This is where we combat all the things that actually are the reason for feminism to arise. In discrimination, violence, injustice, all of the things that are important for women to combat. And for the first time, I think they have the tools. And the tools are within reach. And therefore, to me, someone like Afroz is an example of how to really, really fine tune your tools so that your voice is the voice of lyricism, of a philosophical message, and something that is going to survive long after the protagonists and the enemy has passed on. It will be art, it will be music, it will be poetry. These will speak of the woman's experience in South Asia and beyond. So feminism is here and it's here to stay and it will flourish. This is the woman's century.
Thank you, Salima. Well said. I think it is truly the woman's century. And the tools, as you said, are with us. I think they have been honed. And some new tools will, also sort of be a part of our lives. And so I'd like to put the next question to Anita. Anita, good to have you on the panel. As the curator of, the first woman curator of such a large public event, which was the Kochi Biennale, you must have confronted a lot of challenges. And one challenge that I think we'd like you to share your experiences about is the fact of including women. The whole diversity of women out there and also in a public space. And I think, someone wrote some years ago that India and definitely South Asia exists in different centuries at the same time. And to kind of bring this dialogue on feminism, on women's art, the issues into the public space can be very, very challenging. How did you manage it? Could you sort of tell us about the experience?
Okay, so when you're asked to curate such a large event like that, and you would, as a feminist, you want to carry that consciousness. The first thing was that I had heard for the longest time from my male friends and colleagues that very often they would comment on women's work and say, yeah, it's not good enough. And I was like, I see. So the perception of a lot of wonderful work that we are touched by, which really moves me, is considered not good enough by my male artist colleagues. And that always surprised me. And I was always thinking as to what are the reasons, because I think they are in tune with possibly the market and the capitalist understanding of what art is, like big, robust, all of those categories, and they therefore miss the fragility and the beauty of subtle gestures that very often women artists, make through their work. So the first thing for me was, let's address it. Let's just have as a kind of let's just have more artists, women artists than men. Statistics, okay? Just so if there are 100 artists, I wanted 51 to be women and 49 to be men. And I wanted to construct the Biennale in such a way that it's for the audience to judge whether this thing about quality that all the time has been spoken about, whether we should be able to so in some senses, I find that when you are a curator of a large thing like a Biennale, it's a kind of a performance. You're making a demonstration of your ideas, right? So one of these ideas was that. Then the second idea was that what in today, which is 2018 when I did it, what would a feminist want to do? How do we, and I thought that, a woman, as a feminist, I would like to create solidarities. I would like the role of feminism to be the one where solidarities are created, where it's a warm embrace which embraces all kind of differences, right? And plays that pivotal role of connecting things rather than, making separations. Okay, and therefore the desire to think of all kind of marginalized discourses, the discourses of Dalits, the discourses of, and in my country, women, Muslims, as people now with the right wing having become so powerful and flexing its muscles. So Dalit, Muslim, Christians, queer communities, trans communities, all these discourses which are marginalized discourses, I wanted as a feminist to embrace them and say that unless we form these solidarities, our problems will not be solved. We need to connect. We need to connect not only all these things like Black Lives Matter, Dalit Lives Matter, women's lives matter, poor people's lives matter, you know, all these things, unless we are able to connect these dots, we will remain possibly where we were some time ago, and all, maybe not only that, maybe we start to go backwards. So this was one of the things, and I started, when I started to look at the artists that I would like to include, it was all the women that I had admired over so many years of my, functioning as an artist, as a person who traveled, saw work in various countries, and admired and loved the work that many of my seniors as well as younger people were doing. So it was actually, let's just call it also a labor of love. And I think that this is what feminism can do. We don't have to always be cerebral about things. We can work through our heart, we can work through our, and these are wonderful ways in which you can make the connections. So then let's talk about some of the artists that I chose. And one of the things, I thought that we need to work with people like the Gorilla Girls, because not only the fact that they were not only feminists, but they were also activists, which took the protest right into the street and questioned institutional power structures. Yeah, very often as feminists, we are questioning, the gender power structures, right? But they are the ones who actually put statistics like the Met Museum, the MoMA, how many women artists does it show? What is the percentage of Black artists that they've been showing? So through absolutely hardcore statistics, through posters, through billboards and things like that, they actually questioned institutional power. In a very, very subversive, as well as, let me call it, humorous, as well as in your face, with the gorilla mask. So I thought, that's great. We need to get things like that into through our audience, to our younger artists. They must see all this. They must have a direct confrontation with the way women have been, on the one hand, aggressive, you know and found different methodologies to protect themselves by wearing this gorilla mask, and by actually then challenging all notions of beauty, all capitalist notions of beauty associated with women. So, but on the other hand, you could also, I enjoyed so much working with Shireen Nishat in a very old work of hers called Turbulent. And then, I had this wonderful conversation with Shireen, and she was not happy. She said, Anita, show some new work of mine. And I said, Shireen, actually, this is the work that was going to speak closely to my audience, which is here, which has these two screens in which there's a male singer, who sings a love ballad, and the hall is full of you know, an audience, you know, men listening to this wonderful singer singing. And then there is and the scenes, and so it's in opposite sides of the two screens. So on the opposite side is this woman singer, and she starts to sing in a kind of a very sort of powerful guttural, you know, sounds. It's not traditional music. It's and then there is nobody in the audience. She is almost singing to herself, you know, but the singing is so powerful. It's coming from it's actually harnessing sound, just pure sound coming from her stomach. She sometimes almost, it seems as if she's crying, she's screaming, she's all kind of emotions are there in the thing, but there is nobody to listen to. And I thought that, you know, this kind of even though it's a gender binary, it is so strong a statement about the lives of so many women, especially in my part of the world and our part of the world, that so in spite of, you know, the fact that Shirindin was not happy, I actually went through and I selected work which was so specific, very diverse in its nature, but
sorry
which
to disrupt you, Anita, but you just have a minute because we have to keep to time. Sorry.
Really? Oh my God,
Yeah.
there's so much. Okay, so I'm,
you know, kind of
oh,
give us some
I'm
of
just,
it. Yeah.
all right.
Sorry.
So I'm also going to then say that, you know, look at then some younger artists that I worked with, right? Very young, Afroz who actually uses the web and constructs, let's say, Sultana's reality, based on Sultana's, I'm sure a lot of people know about that. And it's a kind of a subversive way in which women who read or even who do embroidery and sewing can construct another fantastical imaginative reality, which is totally subversive. So even though these are sanctioned, you know, things that women are supposed to do, they're supposed to knit, they're supposed to sew, they can also read. But behind these activities can be a very subversive mind, a mind that takes flight and actually into a kind of a very futuristic and very fantastical realm, which is very, very subversive. And Afra uses these things brilliantly in constructing a kind of a web narrative out of that. What else can I say? Even people like, so the younger.
But what about the public? May I, Rita, may I just say something? How was the response of the public? Because, you know, that whole conflict that we sometimes face.
I think the public, because it was not, because the whole Biennale was not considered, you know, not confrontational as such, right? And as I said, I built up a thing of solidarity where I worked with men who are feminists, who are non-violent, who have such gentle and such beautiful work that they make. So there's a possibility to actually select and create a structure which actually has a rhythm, has a musical rhythm, has a poetic rhythm, which as Salima ji was saying, that it's in this century of women, the 21st century, which is going to be the century of women, all these things are the things that will move people, and these will be the things that will matter, basically, because they will touch you, they will affect your heart, they will affect you. And I think through emotion we are going to speak, and we are going to communicate and tell people how we want the world to be.
Thanks, Anita. That was wonderful. And now I'd like to invite Sangeeta to join in the conversation. Sangeeta, you know, you're tucked away up there in the shadow of the Himalayas and of course the K2. We don't always know a lot about the art scene in Nepal, and particularly about what women artists are doing there. Maybe, you know, you can share some of it with us. What are the critical areas they're working in?
First of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I always think that because Nepal was never colonized, we are somehow not in this dialogue when it comes to with the Commonwealth, or whether it comes to people looking at South Asian art, we're a bit of an enigma and a mystery. And I would say the same goes for Bhutan. These two mountainous countries are really left out of the discourse. But before I go on, I would like to talk about realities that were present. Nepal only opened up the rest of the world in 1952. In fact, my ancestor sealed the hard borders with India, and we didn't accept any foreigners to come into Nepal. There was a revolution to unseat the Ranas. My maiden name is Rana. So we were the despots and the tyrants that were opposed. And in 1951, we had panchayat system, which lasted for a good 30 years. And it was during this time, just for a few dates, we're talking about feminism. The first women's college only opened in 1951. Sati was banned by my ancestor in 1922. And college for men only opened in 1918. So these are very recent dates. And the first art school in 1934. And the first maybe museums around that time. And the director of the museum and the director of the zoo were one and the same person. So he would run to the zoo and then run back to the museum and juggle both. This happened during the Rana time. It was also a time when women were not given any space at all. A time of sati. My mother's generation was the first generation of women to have access to education, even though we came from privileged families, from ruling families. My mother's generation was the first generation that breastfed their own children. The elite never breastfed their own children. So my mother always used to say to me, you're a very lucky child, I breastfed you. And I said, why? What's so lucky about that? Aren't women all over the world doing that? She said, no, my mother, your grandmother never did that. So, what does that say about the female body? A woman from the village was brought in, someone who had recently just delivered a child, and she was brought into the palaces. A buffalo provided to the family. And these wet nurses lived like family members in all our households. A very complacent lot. We were not taught to question. If we were too educated, it was dangerous. But my father was, sent us all to universities abroad, treated us equally as sons. And I lived in Pakistan for a little time. In the 80s, 81, 82, I was there. I think it was the time of Ziaul Haq. And then I came back to Nepal in 83 and started the gallery. And at that time, the women artists were like all the rest of the artists, painting landscapes, really rejoicing in nature. The artists of that time returned from Paris. We have artists like Pamela Giri, Urmila Upadhyaya. They were also in Shantiniketan, so the Gandhian influence was there. And really, it was about community, but it was never questioning the authorities. It was only in the late 80s when there was dissent growing against the system, the panchayat system itself, that we begin to see artists who begin to question the state. And it was not just the artists, it was the writers, theater personalities, the musicians, a growing sort of voice against the state and how it was being managed. And at that time, we have artists like Ragini Upadhyaya, who was talking about the body and also about putting herself in a place where she would ask the audience to ask questions about how governance was happening. At this time, we also had a show by Pakistani artists, Meher Afroz, Sumaya Durrani, Rifat Alvi, and Muhammad Kazim. And I was just amazed by the work of Meher Afroz and Sumaya Durrani, because that was not the Pakistan I had encountered in the 80s. Salima spoke of subterfuge. I could see it, and these questions were not being asked by the women artists of my country. It led me to wonder, if anyone asked or said anything about women's rights, people always said, she must be backed by an NGO. It must be backed by a missionary. This idea that any questioning was foreign-led, right? So in this background, suddenly we have a younger group of artists who come in. Artists like Ashmina Ranjit, who are talking about the body, who are talking about sexuality, who are questioning issues like menstruation. It's a highly taboo subject here. And she was bold enough to create a ball gown made of sanitary napkins and walk into a public space with a little sachet of menstrual blood, which she squished onto the pad, and she invited male participants to do the same. And, people began to run away from her. You have she also was there with an amazing series called Hair Warp. And that was about widowhood. Because, if you are a widow in old times, you went on the Sati fire or you were banished to Benares and you were shaved. And so what does the hair mean? It's a part of the Sora Singar, the I don't know if everyone is familiar with that word, but a part of auspicious adornment of the woman. So you have artists like Lakshmina on the scene. And then later, we have artists like Shilasa Raj Bhandari, who from Art Tree, a collective which says, as citizens of Nepal, they want to use their medium of art to address injustices, question society. So you have artists like Shilasa Raj Bhandari. You have artists like Bunu Dungana, who's a photographer who went through who faced violence at home and had the courage to speak out with some wonderful photographic works. Violence against women is growing. I don't know if it is only being reported now and it was always there, but it was never spoken of. But, a lot of this is a country where 41% of the girls under 18 are married off. So, and in the Tarai, on the southern belt with India, we have issues of dowry deaths, and also a very strange custom where women can be identified as witches within the community. And they are, stoned or cast out of the village. So, I spoke to Niilofur the other day, and she said in Kalash, they also have menstrual huts. And in our Himalayan region, these menstrual huts are very much a reality even today. So we have, a lot of our younger generation of artists who have the courage to speak about the body, to speak about these very pressing issues of gender, also land ownership. I remember when I first came back to Nepal, the mother was never listed in your citizenship paper. It was only the father. So people like Ashmina Ranjit, with her billboard art, she inserted the name of the mother and said, the female voice counts as well. Women have the right to drive the force of the country. We also had a Maoist revolution in the 90s. And the Maoist revolution, even though it was bloody and so many people lost their lives, it also called on women to join the insurrection. And the insurrection was also against the patriarchy. Women picking up arms and being game changers in the politics of the nation. They called on indigenous people who had been marginalized for centuries, different ethnicities, different religions, to join the movement. And all this really culminated in a revolution. And in 2009,
Sakita, can I just interrupt? Sorry, we're running out of
yeah.
time. So,
Yes.
can we just give 2 more minutes, please, if you could?
Yes. So now we have a system where there's a 33% representation of women in parliament, and this is a victory of sorts. So this is the situation, and you know, 21st century as a century for women, women holding up half the sky. I think men make women hold up half the sky so they can still do their nonsense. In the 22nd century, we want to hold the entire sky. Okay, we're not going to just hold up half the sky. We're going to hold up, yeah, we're going to make the men hold half the sky and we're going to do the work. Yeah.
That's a great note to end on. Yes, Sarah?
Thank you, and I'm sorry I had to ask you to, you know, we could go on much longer. I wish we could do another round with everyone, but Salman, could I ask you to give your concluding remarks, and then we could maybe take 2 questions, because we have a few questions coming from our attendees.
Well, I was just wondering that perhaps we could get responses, succinct responses on the 2 questions that you have before we could sum up today's very great and enriching.
Sure. Yeah. So with our first question is, what advice would you give for emerging female artists to be supported by artists and curators?
Who would like to take this one? Salima, would you like to take that question?
You know, I think that we're looking at the fact that we see on the ground women artists creating their own opportunities. I mean, for the first time, I have seen women away from the center, not Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, but women artists from places like Mardan, places like Bhavalpur, places like Faisalabad, places like Multan, really taking upon themselves to create spaces, making their own networks. Most of them are, I have to say, in the happy position of being able to teach. So they are getting these clusters together in which they are able to make opportunities for showing work in whatever kind of circumstances that they are. And very important, enter into conversations. Because I think it is the conversation, the dialogues that they're able to generate where they are, and they're kind of blurring the outlines and blurring the boundaries. I mean, there's young artist in Faisalabad who is doing performance art, and she has the courage to actually do it where she is, not having to come always to Lahore or to Karachi or wherever, but you know, creating a circumstance in which 1 or 2 or more people can do something right there locally. And to me, that shows that there is a kind of confidence which has emerged in recent times. I went specially to Mardan, to the university there, to the fine arts department, because I was so impressed by the work of one of the artists, who did not go the usual way of, you know, very representational academic work, but went straight into work which stemmed from things like experiences with materials and working them and getting to talk about it to her students, and therefore taking them, you know, beyond what they would normally be expected to do in the classroom. So I think I would say that women artists have to now make their own opportunities. More and more residencies are becoming available, which are not grand things, but simple things in which 3 or 4 people get together. They have an empty house, they have a space they can use, they get together for a couple of weeks, and then they have an open house. To me, that is really the kind of thing that gives me a lot of hope and makes me very optimistic about how the next, you know, what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
let's take the second one.
We'll
Thank you.
take another question because we have a couple, but I've just chosen a couple. Patriarchy in Pakistan is so deeply embedded. There is no need for men to impose it. Women also enable it through the image of an ideal woman, pure and perfect. While the bad behavior of men is easily excused, women are not allowed anything less than perfection. How can one bring our society to modern day age where it is okay for women to be imperfectly human?
I think, Salman, you should take this question. Absolutely.
Patriarchy is not men or women only. And masculinity, or the notion or glorification of masculinity, objectification of women and women's potential and their bodies and their lives, commodification of women is not necessarily always carried out by this sex or the other sex. So men's objectification and commodification of men and notion of masculinity does not necessarily live within men. And similarly, I think these are larger. It's a very clever question, and it's a very, very important question because it reminds us that even states can be patriarchal. Systems can be patriarchal and are patriarchal. Our belief systems can be patriarchal. Our policies and our practices and our traditions and our cultural mores could internalize over a long period of time various forms of patriarchy, various forms of masculinity. So it does not necessarily, it is not necessarily a homogeneous or a static notion which can only be associated with the male mind or male life or male body, where institutions, we find, they become and they undertake patriarchal and extremely masculine positions, very anti-women and misogynist positions. And similarly, we also find that within these frameworks, men and women often both internalize patriarchy and masculinity. They both often become custodians, protectors, and abettors of both patriarchy and masculinity. I think the point in reference is many women's organizations also, some of the faith-based organizations, which on the one hand, if you look at these faith-based organizations, you'd find that there is a call for greater freedom of mobility, there is a call for greater decision-making, but at the core and essence of it, you find that many of these organizations, they actually adhere to notions, systems, practices, beliefs, and frameworks, which in essence are extremely patriarchal. So patriarchy is not always visible as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Where
Misogyny.
Savita, this question is actually, it came up, the next question came up when you were speaking, so I'm going to address it to you. Either women are worshipped or they're considered not human, like motherhood is pure and always forgiving, selfless. Do you think attempts by feminism, multicultural or not, made a space of awareness for post-pregnancy depression, postpartum depression, that whole discussion?
I think the whole point about multiple feminisms is to involve all levels of women and women's issues and women's problems, and to make them open so they're everyone's issues and problems. And part of the reason that I said I'm glad you brought up misogyny is because there is systemic patriarchy and systemic misogyny that has been passed from generation to generation. And probably the cruelest women are, the cruel things women face are often at the hands of other women. And that is one of the cycles that we need to break, and our daughters and our sons need to break. And hopefully, and this is not about religion, this is simply about a cultural ethos that we've all taken for granted for a long time, and it's time that it stopped. So I agree with Salima, if this century is the century of women, let's not wait, Sangeeta, till the next century for men to hold up half the sky. Let's do it in the next 50 years.
And thank you for that, Savita. And Sangeeta, someone has written from Cecilia, has written from Philadelphia, saluting dear Sangeeta. Please could you mention the name of the artist that addresses the theme of menstruation? Can you unmute, please?
I wrote back to her, but I'd like to tell you about the systematic sort of mindset. Every year in Nepal, there's a festival called Rishi Panchami. Anita must be knowing that. I don't know if you have it in India, but at that time, when I first got married, I was delivered these 108 twigs. And so I said, what is this? And they said that is 108 twigs because you have to absolve yourself of all the sins you incurred when you menstruated, and you might have touched a man or touched a flower or done this or that. So you have to wash your mouth with a neem stick 108 times, and you have to wash your body for any sins you might have committed 108 times. So I said to the lady who delivered it to me, and does my husband do this? And they said, oh no, he doesn't need to do that. It's only the women. So it's not just me, it's right across the country. Women are doing this. When a family member dies, something called the Garuda Puran is recited at home. And you have to listen to it for the 13 days while you're in mourning. And it's like a horror story of all the crimes that women have committed. Nothing about the men, and you will go to the sixth realm of hell because you lay with a woman who menstruated, or she might have fed you something. So, it's after a while I said, stop. Because you can read it in Sanskrit, I don't need to understand it. And, but this is what everybody is listening to. And this is what everybody is made to believe, that we are at fault, that we are the sinners.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I reject it.
No, totally. Misogyny is built into them. Misogyny is so deeply traditional. Yeah.
I think there's so much more that everyone would like to say now, but I'm sorry, we're going to have to say our goodbyes now. And I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank all our attendees. Niilofur, would you like to say something? Or
I think Salman has something to say. Salman, your concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. So, well, it's impossible to give a summing up of this rich and enriching discourse that we had, and also full of nuance, but very, very quickly providing all of us with a snapshot of which doesn't do any justice to the richness and the nuanced conversations that we've had. We started with Savita Apteji, and she reminded us of women's voice and the importance of women's voice, not only in terms of visibility or the voice making its own agenda, but in the literary history through Rekhti and other such traditions. There's a Sufi tradition also, which runs parallel, where the feminist, where a feminine voice is used to evoke resistance, to evoke a sense of almost rebellion at times. But you also reminded us that women's voice has been used also to look at life in its totality as a weapon against colonial canon and censoriousness, you charted that trajectory right from the lawgiver Manu, and you brought the discourse in that large span to contemporary times where young people are discovering their own brave new world in the new urbanized environments. Salima Hashmi reminded us that the pandemic, and in the last 7-8 months, the world has yet again unearthed at an unprecedented scale its approach towards half of its population. And the horrific rise, the horrific visibility of violence against women and girls. And if I could add from my side, violence against trans communities as well. You also touched upon, and then you shared your reflections on Meher's work and her own trajectory, her own uprootedness or her own displacement from India to Pakistan and coming to a city where one could find not only a new ecosystem, new environment, but your own words, a sort of cultural aridness or cultural strangeness or aloofness that for which her industrious work, her dynamic presence and contributions to not only Karachi's but Pakistan and the region's art collective, it created those bridges. You reminded us that her work is akin to a talisman. It's akin to a beautiful spiritual piece that has a dialogue within. You look at it, it looks beautiful, but if you understand it more, or you understand the language and its vocabulary, you can begin to communicate. But there is a deeper level there also, where the artist herself is in a dialogue with a certain reality, and you need to decode various layers, but every layer is rewarding unto itself. Ultimately, you said the 21st century is the century of women's voice, the voice of philosophy, the voice of lyricism, the message which will sustain for times to come, where our bodies, never mind our bodies sustain or not, and we all agree with that. That led to the discussion with reflections from Anita ji. Anita ji, you reminded us the importance of connecting the dots. You reminded us that the feminist movement is not only about looking inwards, but it's also looking at making alliances. It's about creating solidarities across the board and across the binaries, whether it is movement of the disenfranchised, the dispossessed, and the disadvantaged at any level, or marginalized and vulnerable, but also connecting with the youth, connecting with the LGBTQ, various movements, all those movements that are standing and resisting a certain status quo, certain imposition, and are calling for larger human freedoms. The movement needs to communicate, create synergies with them, and ensure that there is a greater osmosis of knowledge. There's a greater osmosis of shared experiences. There's a greater osmosis of expertise. You also pointed out that, for example, the Guerrilla Girls, they're a specific form of creating public space and protest as an art form. And I think this is something that I also touched upon in my earlier remarks, that led us to a very, very rich trajectory mapping of Nepal's own journey by Sangeeta Rana Thapaji, who traced Nepal's glasnost, as it were, from early 50s, its isolation to becoming part of a very dynamic part of the region. The SAARC Secretariat is placed now in Kathmandu, and while people from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan and Sri Lanka and Maldives might find it difficult to travel from across borders to each other's country, but all roads do converge to Kathmandu. So it is quite a journey from its isolation to becoming a central meeting point for the SAARC region, the 8 countries of SAARC region. But this journey has been a journey full of events, and it's a journey of thresholds and challenges and benchmarks, many of which have been scaled by women and which women continue to scale, and in particular women artists, where they have challenged the given knowledge, they have challenged the censoriousness, they've challenged the given frameworks, and they have touched upon through their literary and creative expression the areas that were hitherto or still considered as taboo. So it's making the sacrilege a discourse, bringing away, ripping the sacrilege or the reverence of their outwardly masks, and just taking away the binary between which is what is reverent and what is irreverent, in fact becoming eclectically more irreverent. So in all, what we have learned today, and this is for ladies and gentlemen who have joined the discussion today, that we have heard that the feminist critique continues to suffuse thinking of many disciplines, from anthropology, post-colonialism, literary studies, indigenous histories, and of course, art history and art practice. There's also recognition of heterogeneity within the feminist standpoints, the multiple feminisms, and the range of contributions to contemporary discourse on social, political, climate, economic discourse with a powerful diversity. And this multiplicity of feminist positions in art and literature, and we heard this from our 4 August panelists, is clearly anchored in a shared ground of certain rejection. And that rejection is to have women's social and political agenda being appropriated by patriarchal histories, traditions, institutions, and systems. And this shared ground brings us here. It brought us here to get together at this forum this evening, and I'm sure that this shared ground would expand, widen, and deepen. And it looks back in the eye of all forms of hitherto and continued repressions, impositions, and usurpations. And beyond creative anger, as we heard from Anita ji, repression is responded to often through satire, celebration of women's own connect with diverse groups, with robust and witty dialogue, which recognizes a continuity of many fronts, of many types of engagements, and many more attempts that remind us of the endless need for a 3-dimensional and a 360-degree rooted and situated critique of politics, history, ideology, faith, tradition, and women's voices. This is a new socio-political surround of women's creative expression, and it is an equalizing space where important conversations or nexus amongst history, tradition, misogyny, inequality, oppressions are constantly happening. And today's panelists so richly contributed to this discourse. My salutations to all of you, and gratitude and debt. Thank you. Over to you, Niilofur.
Thank you very much, Salman. And I think I'll now ask Zara to, for her, last acknowledgements. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our attendees who stuck around. I know we really went ahead of time, but this was really exciting. It was really fun. For those of you who've joined us, I'm sure you want to know more about Meher and A Beautiful Despair, which gives new insights into the art of Meher Afroz. We'll be launching on the 14th of November. You can pre-order and avail an early bird discount. Please visit our website, www.meherafrozthebook.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. The handle is A Beautiful Despair. And our next webinar is on the 6th of November. And that's also going to be really exciting. We have a wonderful panel across continents, and that will explore decolonization. So be sure to register for that. Thank you. Have a wonderful night or a great morning wherever you are, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was
Thanks.
lovely. It was a lovely.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks.
you all. Thank you
We'll
all.
see you all. Thank you. Bye.
Yes.
Thank you, Salima. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you, Nita. Lovely to see you.
Lovely.
We beat the visa. We beat the visa.
I know.
We don't need visas anymore.
So how long can we just keep zooming?
We will keep going. We'll outlive our enemies. We'll outlive our enemies.
Thank you, everyone. I have to end.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. It was lovely listening to you. Thank you so much. Thank you.